Hello, and welcome to CAN TV Conversations. I'm Zach Shanis, and today we're talking about a recent investigative reporting project on the mostly unsolved murders of 51 Chicago women. Joining me today is John W. Fountain. He's a professor of journalism at Roosevelt University. Thank you for joining me today.
My pleasure. Good to be here.
So first, do you mind telling us about your background and how it led you to where you are today?
I knew that I wanted to make a difference growing up because I saw poverty, I saw crime, and I wanted to do something that I thought would give me an opportunity to make a difference in my life and also my community. I thought I would become a criminal attorney, but something happened. Someone said life is what happens when you make other plans. And so I attended the University of Illinois in Champaign, and I'd always loved writing. And I remember as a freshman writing a piece entitled "I Am a Shadow," and it was off of a piece that off of the book by Ralph Ellison entitled "Invisible Man." Invisible Man. And I thought, as a teenager, Black teenager in Chicago, if I were invisible, people would not react to me. But I see a visceral, sometimes visible response when I walk into a room. I said, I don't feel like I'm invisible. I feel like a shadow. So I wrote this piece, and my instructor at Illinois copied it for all the freshman rhetoric classes. And people were reading my work, and I was just completely turned on again to writing. And she said, you got to think about becoming a journalist. And I said, okay. So I guess I really wasn't wed to becoming an attorney. And so I graduated from the University of Illinois, earning my master's degree in journalism. And my first job out of college was at the Chicago Tribune. But I'd done a number of internships. So by the time I got to the Tribune, I think I had 5 or 6 internships by then. And as a Tribune reporter, I didn't know what I was going to cover fresh out of college. Didn't know what I wanted to cover, just wanted to write stories. But I ended up being a general assignment reporter, covered a lot of crime, working nightside GA. And I happened upon this story called Murder. And it became very clear to me that because I knew the addresses and the names in some cases and the faces in many cases looked familiar, at least they were Black like mine. And I understood as a reporter that if I wasn't doing those stories, to some degree, they weren't the kinds of stories that were likely going to get told in the Chicago Tribune. And so I gravitated toward those stories. All of that is the background in terms of covering homicide, later working for the Washington Post and as a national correspondent for the New York Times. I kept coming back to the story called Murder. And it isn't that I like the grim statistics or the grisly nature of the stories that I've written, but the challenge was always to humanize the victims because they came to my attention because of their death. But that was only one thing that happened in their life. And so there was always so much more to these stories. And as a professor, I wanted to share those kinds of stories and the way we approach those stories to make them human so that society gets a closer picture of who these people really are, so that we move beyond the stereotypes. We move beyond this kind of typical journalism that we too often fall victim to and write stories that seek to matter. And no story in my mind, as I began to look at a possible convergence project, offered the kind of depth and heft and social justice notion than the story of 51 mostly African-American women who have been slain in Chicago since 2001 and believed to be the work of, at least according to one organization, the work of a possible serial killer.
So recently you led a Capstone journalism course with 16 students at Roosevelt, and the Capstone project sought to examine these mostly unsolved murders of the 51 Chicago women over the past 2 decades. Do you mind just telling me a little more about this project and what you have discovered through the investigative journalism?
Now, in approaching the story, it is not for John Fountain to say as a reporter whether there is or is not a serial killer. That was not the task of our project. the task was simply to humanize these stories. And the story had been written to some degree, covered by mainstream media. But mostly it is a story, a case that has been ignored. And I get it. I'm a journalist. I'm a professor. I've been in the business. I know if it bleeds, it leads. And, we don't like to admit that, but it is the truth. And sometimes, especially given that we are in now a 24-hour news cycle, that there is this race to be first, and so on, and all of the elements that contribute to the way we do journalism today. Some stories just get lost. But there is a way, I think, to elevate them. And part of the way to do that is to humanize them. And so it was an excellent opportunity for us to look at not just the cases, particularly to sort of, say that there have been 51 women murdered, and to provide some of the details about the facts of the case and so on, but to really try and delve into the lives of the women who had been murdered. And so it was a very difficult thing to do. When I first contacted Thomas Hargrove and I told him what my idea was, he laughed. I probably would have laughed too. And he didn't mean any harm. He was just saying that, John, that's a really ambitious project. He said, but I'll tell you this. He said, anything you can do that would bring light to these stories is a positive thing. And on that note, I said, well, thank you very much. We're going to go off and see what we can do. And so it meant relying on, as we would say, tough shoe leather reporting, making phone calls, contacting possible sources, utilizing social media, electronic databases, and trying to track down the next of kin for these women. And we had a scarce list. Of course, we had the names of the women, and we were able, honestly, to get the next of kin for many of these women. But then the pandemic hit. And social distancing, and universities were closed, and we were remanded to essentially remote learning. And but the students stuck with it, and we were able to find some of the families of the victims to talk with them. And we also decided that we would do stories about organizations that were trying to help at-risk women, to do stories about grassroots organizations, and other elements of this story that we could piece together as a kind of collective, which appears on our website.
You talked about this kind of humanizing aspect of the project. Do you mind just defining that to a greater extent, and what you mean by, like, we tried to humanize these women?
I think there is something in us, in our nature as human beings, that we absorb the number, but then we dismiss it. And it just doesn't, it has no humanity necessarily attached to it. It is different than showing a photo or painting a picture of someone and allowing the reader or the viewer to look into the eyes and into the soul of the person who has been murdered or who is missing. And so we were brought to this story, all of these women in this collective, by the fact that they were murdered. One fact, one commonality. We know that they were Black, they were women, but the fact that they were murdered. And so what we wanted to do, just in terms of humanizing, it means showing that they were flesh and blood and heart and soul, and that there were so many relationships that were connected to them, that this was somebody's daughter, this was someone's mother, this was someone's cousins, this was someone's aunt, this was someone's grandmother, this was someone's wife or sister. And so in doing that, it has the great ability to bring people face to face with our human commonality. And it's hard to dismiss that. It is hard to dismiss that. And I think that is important, and has been shown to be important throughout history, that we dismiss numbers. But show me, let me see, tell me the story of this person. And it has the ability not only to affect change in a more wider sense, but also to affect change internally, person by person. So we want Chicago to care. We want them to see these women. They're not trash. They're not dogs. They're not, even though they were discarded as trash, and many of them, their bodies set on fire. These were people. These were daughters of Chicago.
And I guess kind of going off that, my follow-up to that would be, who do you hope benefits from this project? Who is kind of your target audience? Is this meant for the families of the victims? Is this meant for the greater Chicago community? Is this meant for the wider nation? Like, who, in your opinion, was this targeting?
Well, it may sound hokey, but in one sense, it was in essence being a voice for those who can't speak for themselves, who can no longer speak for themselves. Women whose voices, in our estimation, in one sense, cry out from the grave for justice. And the target audience is whoever has an ear, whether that is city officials or police officials or grassroots community organizations. But to really, and that's in Chicago and beyond. So since the story is run, it was picked up locally by WGN. It's run in People Magazine, the Oxygen publication. It's been mentioned on the Poynter Institute. It's appeared on the Global Investigative Journalism Network worldwide. So I've had folks from Africa and even Russia tweet the story and so on. So here's the thing. We write what is happening in our world and bring attention to it, but there are so many similar stories happening across this world. And so if it sparks hope for someone in Nigeria, or hope for someone in Russia, or hope for someone in some other corner of this world where this kind of thing is happening. And what I mean by not necessarily just, and I'm not minimize it, not necessarily murder of women, so to speak, but in this stealing of people's voices and their humanity, in this kind of ignoring this atrocity that impacts us all. If it brings some sense of hope, then, we've done our job.
In your opinion, like, why did the stories of these women get so forgotten?
I think part of the reason this story has sort of fallen through the cracks, quite honestly, is because they're Black and because they're women. I'm unapologetic about that. And when I, talk about diversity in newsrooms, and I've talked about it for years, one of the reasons I think is really important is because we all bring something to the newsroom. And if we're going to purport that the platter of daily American journalism represents all the stories, all the news that's fit to print, if it is indeed that, if it is indeed reflective of society in its totality, then there shouldn't be whole swaths of society missing from the daily platter of American journalism. And so we need folks who look like me, or folks who look like some of my students who were on this team. Because quite frankly, when I saw the pictures of the women, it was hard for me to look at them and not to see my aunt, to not see my daughters, to not see my sister, to not my sisters, to not see my mother. And so it hits home for me, and that's okay. And I think that, I don't blame anyone for that, but I think because of the inherent bias in media, in news media, that I think that, it is a story that is just not risen to the kind of level where it is getting the attention that it merits. And the good news is that can change by editors making a decision that this is an important story. And I will say this again on the record, that if there were this many dogs, if there were 51 dogs in the city of Chicago who have been murdered, who have been slain, who have been asphyxiated or strangled, their bodies set on fire. The city would do something about it. Now, if they're not doing anything about it, and if it's not in the daily newspapers, if we are not continuing to draw attention to this, because there is somebody out here who has killed these women who is still out here and will do it again and again and again. And I don't need Thomas Hargrove or a serial killer expert to tell me that. And so it has to, if this isn't a story, I don't know what is a story. So I think that who's ever at fault, we can fix it real fast by bringing some attention to this.
And I guess kind of my last question that I have is, why did you feel that this project would benefit as a student project? And what did you hope that your students would gain from it?
It has become apparent, very clear to me, that unless the journalists of the future get exposed to certain kinds of issues and develop sensitivities to the need for us as the collective body of journalism to examine these kinds of issues, not much is going to change. So it is incumbent upon me as a professor to do everything I can in journalism school. To say, the wonderful thing about education, it does not tell you what to think. It doesn't even tell you necessarily how to think, but it encourages you to think and to follow your heart and your mind, and to, as journalists, follow your intuition, and to use this world, to see it as an oyster, to move beyond downtown and the Magnificent Mile and the Gold Coast, which I love, but to go to what I call the Code Coast and to find those stories and to see life on the other side of the tracks. So that's one of the reasons, the major reason behind this project. And to give them an opportunity to explore, to look in the faces of people who don't necessarily look like them, and to see their humanity, and to allow that experience to dispel some of the stereotypes, and to understand that as a journalist, if we give you oxygen and send you to the moon, you can do your job. You just got to be open to doing that. And so what I think they took from this is that they got to see life on the other side of the tracks. They got to hear the stories, the moving stories of people who have lost their loved ones forever. The stories of hope that justice may someday prevail, and to examine a story that just by their own research, they were able to see for themselves has been large a story. It is a story that has been largely neglected by the mainstream press, and it requires that they ask themselves why, and how they answer those questions is completely fine by me. They'll figure it out, but I think they're better for having taken this journey.
Thank you. Well, my thanks to Professor John W. Fountain for joining us today to have this very important conversation. And thank you for watching CAN TV Conversations. I'm Zach Shanis. Have a good day.